Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Lookout. Today is the 14th of September, and we're coming to you from Chico, California. If you're joining us for the first time, this is the Lookout. We provide wildfire intelligence and context to talk about prescribed fire, fire ecology, how wildfires are fought. I draw on my experience from about 30 years in wildfire, both as prescribed fire specialist and mapping specialist, and try to give you a bit of some context as to how wildfires work, how they get fought, some of the limitations we face in fighting them. We try to keep some of the politics out of it. You're not going to find us sharing conspiracy theories here, but we are going to talk about our experience with how large fires get fought, and this is not official wildfire information. This is entertainment, education, and intelligence all kind of rolled into one. So thanks for joining us. Thanks, Feral Cat, for jumping in. And kind of in an interesting period of time here in Northern California. Kind of in an interesting period of time here in Northern California with wildfire. We're coming out of a decade where we've seen extraordinary losses, extraordinary fire behavior, kind of incredible things in the way that the fires have behaved that a lot of people who've been in fire their whole careers have never seen before or expected. And now we're having a couple slow seasons where we've got kind of mild conditions, and all of us are kind of having to adjust our wiring. We all got wired up for mega fire with Dixie Fire, and we all got wired up for bad things happening. We all got wired up for firing operations getting lost, massive losses on timber, massive disaster. And so now we're in this kind of lull a little bit where fire is behaving the way it used to behave, and we all have to adjust our expectations and our filters, right? So what I like to do on this show is just use the current events as kind of a framework to talk about the history of fire in the landscape, fire management. And right now there's some interesting things happening with firing operations on the Six Rivers National Forest. Interesting things are happening with the way we're managing fires kind of all across the landscape here, be it on the Klamath National Forest, the Six Rivers, the river complex. We've got 3 different incident management teams assigned in Northwestern California, and each one of them's getting a little bit different direction in how they're going to deal with the fires. So I think it's interesting to look at the differences between the forests and how the teams are kind of reacting. I think it's important to keep in mind that when these fires get large, we bring in incident command teams, and the incident command teams, they work on a delegation of authority from the line officer, so the forest supervisor. And as we've said before, that's why complexes kind of get split up along forest boundaries. The team that's right now working on the Klamath, the Happy Camp complex, they're working for the forest supervisor there. And we've got 2 Type 1 teams working for the forest supervisor for the Six Rivers. And the fires that those 2 teams are handling are kind of quite different in their kind of proximity to major infrastructure or towns. So we've got the SRF complex that's mainly burning kind of way out in the middle of nowhere. And then we've got the Smith River complex, which is threatening Highway 199 corridor and Gasky and kind of a more populated area, major power line corridor, major transportation corridor for the far north coast. So we've seen kind of different strategies employed by the different teams. When it comes down to it, fire doesn't really care about your strategy or your politics or the direction you're getting from your line officer. But this year it's interesting in just that fire has really pretty much been mild and not pushing very hard, except for a couple days. So we're going to jump in and we're going to look at the Pearch Fire near Orleans. We're going to look at the Mosquito and Bluff 2 fires that are burning kind of in the middle of nowhere north of Wichipec. Look a little at the fires on the Happy Camp district of the Klamath, and then Smith River Complex. And we're going to cover a new fire today, which is the Anvil Fire up near the coast in Port Orford, Oregon. So we've been looking at the PG&E weather. They've got this great network of weather sensors, and we've been looking at that every morning. Right now we see some kind of high gusty winds kind of around Gasky, 25 miles an hour. But for the most part we see, and some of these sensors are on ridgetop locations, which is why some of them are really maxed out, 25 miles an hour. Other ones are 0 that are in the bottom of the canyons. In general, fairly mild winds, unless you happen to be right in the wind tunnel like this one. But what's interesting now is we're looking at humidity. We've been looking at humidity every morning. And yesterday morning, the humidities were pretty uniformly above 60%. Earlier this morning, there was some 25% humidities out around on the ridgetops out around Gasky. And so in general, we're seeing lower humidities right now. And that's because we've got kind of offshore winds. Yesterday on the imagery, you could see the fire kind of pushing. Fires were pushing the smoke out over the ocean. So we got the east winds. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Temperatures are warmer this morning. Yesterday morning, generally things were 50s and 60s. We see some spots out here that are 70. So a little bit warmer, a little bit drier this morning. Expected to be hotter and drier this afternoon, kind of peaking today and tomorrow with the high temps. So just real quick to talk about why we get dry east winds is, in general, we've got the Cascade Mountains here. And then out here we've got thousands of miles of desert. Just huge chunk of the interior of the country is pretty dry. Storms come from the west, mountains wring out the moisture. So you've got the interior of the Great Basin and kind of the eastern Oregon and eastern Washington are extremely dry. Montana's really dry. When you start to look at it, even like, Saskatchewan and eastern Montana, it's just super dry. And so when we get north winds and east winds and northeast winds, they're moving over, hundreds or thousands of miles of dry landscape, and that just wrings out all the moisture. So that's why when we see offshore winds in Southern California or offshore winds in Northern California, generally they're very dry, and they generally blow for days at a time. And so usually we ramp up for a few days with drying winds, and then we get kind of the peak of the event. The wind event happens after maybe we've had 3 or 4 or 5 days of drying. And so that's why we get these kind of explosive and dangerous burning conditions when we've got offshore winds. It's just that's usually it's the antecedent drying before the event itself that really sets the stage, and then you get kind of a peak of your wind event and everything's dried out. Maybe you already have some fires that are established, and then bam, you get like a Tubbs fire event or a 2020 Labor Day fires event. The green on here is wilderness areas, just so you know. Anyway, so there's been forecast kind of north and northeast winds. They've started to affect, things have started to dry out a little, started to burn a little more intensely, but not a lot. And it looks like the peak, we're not getting forecasts for any kind of extreme north wind events here. And we're supposed to go into kind of milder, cooler conditions starting around Sunday evening. So this is the infrared satellite. It's kind of real coarse scale, and it's looping from yesterday afternoon through last night and then into this morning. So yesterday afternoon, we saw some flare-ups, a little bit kind of the area that got fired in the last few days on the north end of the river complex, and a little bit down on like the Copper or Blue 2 fire. See that this morning we've got kind of smoked-in canyons here, and we're going to load up from yesterday and see kind of how the winds blew. The smoke clears out and the fires start to burn, blowing out to the west. So that's just showing you that kind of effect of that east wind, that drying east wind, kind of really starting to kind of take off in the afternoon. So back to our fires in Orleans here. We're going to just pull up, we're going to go through them kind of one by one. Here's the Pearch Fire. Not a lot of new heat to report on the Pearch, except that it continues to back down in Butler Creek. But really minor spread, like yesterday. So the area in black is 24 hours of spread. So we're talking like, 50 yards or something, maybe 100 yards over 24 hours of just kind of flanking spread coming down. This area burned 2013 or 2014. So there's a bunch of snags out there. There's some cleanup for it. really moderate fire behavior. A little more interesting stuff to see over here on Mosquito this morning and Bluff. So when we have a fire that gets started and is going to escape initial attack, the fire bosses on whatever forest it is or national park or anything else, they open up this program called WFDIS, which is the Wildland Fire Decision Support System. And that kind of helps them document their decision. And so oftentimes on a fire you expect to become large, you start identifying potential strategies. WFDIS has a lot of information in it. It has fire history, it has private timberlands, it has all these different attributes of the landscape, and you document why you're deciding to do what you're going to do and how you're balancing risk to firefighters against risk to private property and risk to natural resources. And so it's a way that you can have kind of a uniform decision-making process across, all these federal agencies. And it helps document how the fire is going to get fought. So early on in this fire, there weren't that many resources available for these fires that were burning up here in Bluff Creek. And so they kind of identified that they were going to use ridgelines and roads, and they were going to box these fires in with firing operations. And so that's what they've continued to do. We've seen that over the past couple of weeks with firing along the roads, say at the edge of the wilderness here, with firing kind of interior to help carry the fire back down into the drainages so it burns with a beneficial severity. And so we see that here, that they're carrying fire out these ridgelines. And some of this, there's places here where maybe you could come in here and you could pick up this fire going direct. But the question is, well, why? If you're getting beneficial severity in a place that needs fire. The forests have some flexibility in how they manage each fire. And you can have a full suppression fire and still say, well, it's full suppression, but we're going to let it burn out to these ridgelines. So from the get-go, the forest here has been supportive of getting beneficial fire effects out of these fires. And we're kind of in this, we've got a couple days of dry winds, and there's potential for some of these to do something. But there's kind of a rule in firefighting that goes way back, that's go with the guy on the ground. And so, if you're in an airplane, you can't really see what the person on the ground sees. The person in the ground might see that the fire's backing slowly and so it's easy to second guess all these different aspects of fire. There's always someone in an airplane who has a different perspective, but there's always, if there's someone on the ground, they see what the fire's actually doing. And I think that this is a pretty good case for going with the person on the ground. And that I can look at this and I can look at the weather forecast and I can say, Northrop says that there's the 4-month forecast is for above average fire behavior. And if you're on the ground every day out here and you're watching these fires move 50 yards a day or less, you might say, well, that person at Northops that's doing this planning is looking at global climate models, or they're looking at 25-kilometer resolution weather forecasts for 5 days out. Just for perspective, 25-kilometer square is going to cover like this entire area. And so, pretty much what's happening here is the conditions on the ground are conducive to getting good fire done here. And there's been support at the forest level, at the region level, for going with the people on the ground and getting fire on the ground here in this area that hasn't had large fires for 100 years. I want to turn on a layer here just for reference. So we've been talking kind of from the beginning of this fire about how this whole 150,000 acre chunk here from around T-Bar on the Klamath down to Wichipek, these red blobs here are fires that happened in the 1920s. And other than that, there's no fire history in this whole area. Whereas the other parts of the Klamath we've talked about, you've got some places 3 or 4 fires on top of each other in the last 50 years. A lot of fire. And so that now has fragmented that landscape to where you have a fire like the Hancock fire out here that was contained by recent fire on 3 sides and really had nowhere to go. But we don't have that over here. And so the worry early on in these fires was that because we had all this contiguous fuel between Soames Bar and Orleans and these fires, was that you had potential for these fires to kind of become your frying pan fire or your other mega fire. And that's what happens when we have fires in this country with no fire history during drought. I think what the forest would like to see here is they see an opportunity to, if they can maximize the footprint of these beneficial fires, they're reducing ground fuels, we start to fragment this landscape. And now if we have a fire out in here, like this one, it's going to burn out to a previous footprint and be easier to corral on these ridges they're burning off of. So we have an opportunity on a beneficial year to put fire in here. We wouldn't get away with this in a 2020 or 2021. We'd have a Dixie fire. We'd have a Caldor fire. But this year is the year that that's not happening. And so people have made a decision to maximize the benefit of these fires. I see, on Facebook, some criticism of this technique and this fear that these fires are going to get a strong east wind on them that's going to blow them all to hell, and then these guys will be idiots for continuing to have put fire on the ground. But I guess what I'd say is the people that are on Facebook that are writing the loudest about this are not on the ground, and they already have a chip on their shoulder about how the feds are managing fire. So I'm not saying that there aren't a lot of criticisms we can have about how the feds have managed fire and how firing operations have panned out in really bad outcomes. But we really have to put that in the context of climate and weather and drought years versus not drought years. So yes, bad things are going to happen when you put a lot of fire on the ground during a Dixie fire in the peak of drought. Putting fire on the ground in August of a drought year is not, it's not anything anyone really wants to do. But we really have to put this stuff into context of where it's happening, what the weather's like, what the fuel conditions are like, the fact that these fires have been burning for a month with a ton of coaxing of people putting fire on the ground all over the place, and there's still a couple 100 acres, 1,000 acres, 2,000 acres. That tells you something about the burning conditions. Interesting kind of thing going on in the background is just that all this land in blue is land that's in carbon offset projects, where basically it's been set aside to grow carbon and sequester it as part of kind of a big, well, we can talk about carbon all day, but yeah, you've got kind of one of the largest forced carbon offset projects in the country happening right up against this fire. So I've always been worried with this carbon banking that would constrain our ability to let fires burn on the landscape. We've got this private land right here, and there's this definitely a big push on these fires. They wouldn't be so keen on running out and firing ridges out of headleys if they're burning on private land. So they have prioritized on this fire, holding it from going out onto this private land. So I think there's kind of been a kind of fundamental friction between carbon bankers and letting fires burn on the landscape. And we've got to get past that, because letting fires burn on the landscape oftentimes is going to be the best tool we have to ensure the durability of that carbon investment. You guys, if you've been on this show before, you know that we meander, and that the lookout's not linear. So we saw a bit of growth here on the Blue 2 fire yesterday. We could see the heat on the satellite. That's burning out in here. The black areas are areas that were burning, they're 24 hours old. So this is new growth in the last 24 hours. This fire is pushing out. There's a lot of this area is burned in the last 15 years. These fires are in the wilderness, and there's really no direct firefighting going on. There is some indirect, like roads are being prepped out away from them, but there's been pretty much minimal staffing on these fires from the get-go. And as we said, the fact that these fires are a couple thousand acres after a month of burning unsuppressed tells you something about this year's burning conditions. Looking here at the Elliot and Swope fires, no real new spread on these fires outside of what was burned yesterday. We've got the U-Fish fire here, still pushing on Titus Creek, might cross there and burn up into this area, but reading the fire behavior forecast, they don't expect a lot to happen there. We can see that U-Fish now is pretty much filled in this entire area, burning with low severity, beneficial fire. Okay, so there's Smith River Complex. We talked about how each of these complexes has had kind of its own considerations. This one, definitely the 199 corridor is it's the commercial route for this whole area, really including Brookings. So a lot of commercial activity relies on this corridor staying open. The power comes through there. So this fire really, it made a big run like about a week into itself, and then it really has hardly done anything since then. And so we were watching some firing operations up here yesterday, the night before last, and we can see that no fire has been applied out this ridge farther than where it was yesterday morning. This area here got filled in with a firing operation yesterday. It's still hot. One reason they were firing out here is there was heat on this uncontrolled edge of the fire, and they have to kind of stay out ahead of that so these east winds don't come up and push this fire out into here. But one thing we've seen really on this fire is that this big kind of light colored area is both partially in the biscuit fire, but also it's serpentine and hardly anything grows there. So it's almost like a natural fire break. So other than that, on Smith River, we were not really seeing a lot of growth. What we're seeing on this one, we're not seeing big indirect firing operations way out away from the fire like we are on the other fires. There have been some, attempts to put fire on the ground. It's tough for the firefighters on these fires because you've got a plan, you've got a box you're going to build when the fire is active, and then you get some rain, and then you've just got like miles and miles and miles of kind of skunky, kind of burning, kind of not burning. You got conditions that would maybe allow you to go direct on some of this, but then it's like, well, even during conventional firefighting, if you have a choice of putting in 5 miles of direct line through heavy timber and snags versus coming out and firing a mile of road, that's often why we do a firing operation, is just for efficiency and firefighter safety. So, there's a lot of, I hear a lot of kind of complaining like, hey, the fire's laying down, why don't you go direct? And it's like, well, even if it's possible, does it make sense to send crews in and scratch a line around 5 miles here of perimeter for when you could come out and fire off this road, especially if the fire's not even moving? So like we see out in here, we've got all this line, and maybe some of it's direct line, I don't know, but a lot of it isn't moving just on its own. So oftentimes it does make sense to come out here and just fire this ridge. And then even if it doesn't all burn out, you've got a black kind of containment around here if this does wake up a week from now. But it's definitely been a bind for these guys where they had a plan, and then the rain kind of pretty much just halted this fire in its tracks. And then you have to figure out what you're going to do, especially if your primary plan was to fire a bunch of stuff and now it's too wet to fire. Anyway, we're going to hop up here to the Anvil Fire. Had a request from a longtime lookout watcher to talk about the Anvil. So this fire's been burning for a couple weeks. I haven't been following it very closely, but here's Port Orford, just for kind of regional context. Here's the California-Oregon state line, going up the Oregon coast to Port Orford. Coos Bay's up here, so it's about halfway between Coos Bay and Crescent City. It's burning in this grassy knob wilderness. And we've thrown up a week's worth of white lines here that show the daily progression on this fire. So yesterday it made a pretty good run, and the day before that it made a good run also. So for the first, several weeks, it started up on the top here and it just kind of slowly spread out. So each one of these white lines is a day's spread going back about 8 days. And then the day before yesterday, it was here and it made a run. It made a slope-driven run to the top of this ridge. And then yesterday, it squirted over that ridge, and with this east wind, it burned down the hill and it started to push west. So this fire's on the move. It's in the wilderness. There's not a lot of direct firefighting going on, so I haven't found any operations maps for this. Looking at InstaWeb, there's a lot of hand line being prepped. I think the box is kind of out in here, potentially outside the wilderness. There's quite a bit of prep that's been done, and there's structure protection and other work there's hand line down in here that's being done to prep around structures. One thing I saw was they've dropped a ton of retardant on this early on. Lots and lots and lots of retardant, and that didn't work. And what we often say, retardant doesn't work if you don't have firefighters on the ground. It'll slow fire down, it'll buy you some time. But oftentimes it's just a waste, because if you don't have a way to get fire line in here, and you're in heavy fuels and you dump a bunch of retardant, the fire's just going to burn underneath it. So maybe it buys you time. In this case, it's a political thing, right? Like, even if you know the retardant's not going to put the fire out, you're going to dump a lot of it just to tell people that you're trying to do something. Anyway, this fire's going to do what it wants until it comes out to where it can be fought, which is usually what happens with fires that burn in the backcountry. When the fire gets out to the river or the road where it can be suppressed, either it's going to get there in a hurry on a bad day and jump what you had, or it's going to make its way there slowly and you're going to pick it up. But a fire this size, once it's going out in the backcountry, it's not going to be put out direct. It's going to burn until the weather changes. And, it's not a great setup right now in kind of peak east wind season to have this fire just perched out here with all this open perimeter, susceptible to east winds. But the blessing right now is that we don't have forecasts for a bunch of strong east winds. When you look at the regional fire risk assessment that's put out all the time by every day by the GACS, the Coordination Center, there's no forecast right now for kind of massive fire growth on this fire in this whole kind of zone. James Mosher says these fires are nothing compared to the last years. So I think we got to get better talking about that, about the difference between a bad fire year, what makes a bad fire year, what makes a year when you can actually use fire. Just get people to see all the different shades of fire, that it's not all just extreme. We're putting a lot of stuff up on our archive right now on the lookout.org. So I recommend you check out the site. Feral Cat says, have you heard anything about helicopter accident at the T fire? That was a Type 1 helicopter crashed. They got the pilot out. That was Tea Kettle. No, I don't. We kind of followed those from afar. There was a lightning bust that went through the Stanislaus National Forest and the Sierra and the Central Coast, and the conditions were good for suppressing the fires. I guess what I would say, what my first thoughts on that helicopter accident on the T fire is that aviation's really incredibly dangerous. Fire aviation's dangerous. And a lot of these fires that they're jumping right on top of weren't going anywhere. And so another reason to let fires burn in proper conditions is that you minimize exposure. So that pilot and that multi-million-dollar aircraft were wrecked, responding to a fire that may not have really needed to be put out if we get sensible about fire on the landscape. James Mosher says it makes sense to put out the fire when it starts, not days later. And I don't always agree. I think, if we have fires that we're starting right now in the backcountry here in the Klamath, in the backcountry in the Plumas, in a place that's surrounded by the Dixie Fire, there's places we should just be letting these fires burn. And so I agree with you, James, that if we're going to later have to commit 3,000 firefighters to risk themselves on a fire that gets big and escapes control, that's not a good deal. But I disagree that putting out every fire small is really the way to go, because we can be sensible about where we decide to let fires burn. But another part of this whole conversation is control, and admitting that we don't have as much control as we'd like to think, and that letting fires burn has this inherent level of risk, and that there will be bad outcomes, and that we can't always pick those winners and losers with very good detail. But we've been pretending that we have more control than we really do forever, and it hasn't really panned out. We're just burning down vast tracts of wilderness. So this whole thing where the risk of making that decision comes back to a single line officer, a single district fire management officer, that's bullshit. I mean, we've got this socialized problem in that as we've collectively decided to put all the fires out for 100 years. And it's the same thing with prescribed burning. If you decide that the burn boss is going to be on the hook if they light a burn and then it escapes, when the entire society has decided we're going to put out fires for 100 years and created these conditions that created the hazard, like, why is it all on one person to take the heat if you're doing a prescribed burn and it escapes? And because the forest conditions around you are so jacked from 100 years of suppression that it gets away and it becomes this issue. I mean, it puts this enormous personal liability on people that want to do the right thing and that are taking on the mantle of doing this work that's really important. Anyway, thanks for the comments, everyone. See you later.